Good evening and welcome to this per capita webinar in our series that we are now hosting primarily online, although we're hoping to return to face-to-face and hybrid events very soon. My name's Emma Dawson. For those of you I haven't met before, welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation in St Kilda or Naarm, the greater Melbourne area. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past and present and acknowledge the custodianship of the land on which we are so fortunate to live, but land that was stolen and never ceded. And wherever you are, and welcome to any other First Nations people with us tonight. I know all of you will join me in paying respects to the elders of the lands from which you join us. My guest tonight is Dr. Kate Fitz-Gibbon, who is one of our leading researchers on women's safety and has written a terrific essay in the latest series of In the National Interest publications. If you haven't come across them, I know you'll have seen the details in our Eventbrite, but it's a series of essays on issues of national interest and importance from Monash University Press. We originally were going to have lunch with Kate back in August, and then of course we got shut down again. So I'm very, very pleased that she's able to join us here tonight to talk about her fantastic essay, Our National Shame, Violence Against Women. Kate, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Emma. It's just a delight to be here virtually.
Virtually. Can you start by, it's a really, I think, timely essay, but coming from someone that spent such a long time in the field and has seen what we've seen quite an extraordinary year here in Australia with a kind of belated, we thought what was going to be our belated Me Too movement. What prompted you to write the essay, and how do you feel, what do you feel about the environment in which it's landed?
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. For me, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, so paying my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any First Nations people who are joining us today. It's really interesting, and every time I kind of reflect on the book and think about why I wrote it, it's amazing just a week or 2 weeks how much the time is shifting. And certainly at the time that I was very fortunate, Louise Adler, who is looking after the National Interest series for Monash University Press, invited me to write this book. It felt like this incredible moment of change that we were just on the cusp of in Australia. We had had the March for Justice, this movement across Australia where women, young people and some men came together and marched and said enough is enough and was demanding change. And I really thought that looking forward at that point in March, and I marched in Melbourne in the Treasury Gardens, that we would not be in the position we're in today, where we still have this complete leadership vacuum on violence against women. And so it felt really exciting to write a book like this. And I think it was great because it really propelled me to feel bold in the essay, because I felt like, we really had this support for it, and this was the moment of change. For me, coming to that moment has been a journey. I have been studying and researching and working in and around violence against women for the last 15 years. And it really came from perhaps a naivety that I saw a series of criminal justice system decisions in cases of men who had been killed, men who had killed their wives, that were so obviously unjust. And that just kind of piqued my interest. And I was looking, going, is this unusual, or is this, and what does this say about us, that this is how our criminal justice system responds to the most serious forms of violence against women? And so that's really been the start of my work, and it's expanded from there. And certainly over the last 5 years, we've heard at various times the term national emergency, national crisis, national shame be thrown around. And it usually comes after the high profile death of a woman. And we know that, there's only a very small number of those women whose deaths are high profile. And the more and more I looked, the more I understood that this violence is every day for so many Australian women and children. And this isn't violence that occurs in high profile occasional cases. This is the woman that's killed every 8 days by men's violence in Australia. And then we know that those deaths are absolutely the tip of the iceberg. And then when we focus on the deaths, which we so often do, we're missing the full extent of the problem that lurks beneath. So I was really taken by the invitation to write an essay that would try and capture what the full extent of that problem was. And I think the time in which I was writing it, being just after the March for Justice, being just after the year we've had, which, February 2021, we had, the rape allegations that were made by former Australian Parliament staffer Brittany Higgins. We then had, less than a fortnight later, the historic rape allegations against the then anonymous, now not, Cabinet Minister. And there was shock from many, which, teasing that out is an interesting thing in and of itself. We know that 1 in 5 Australian women experience sexual assault. Why are we surprised then when it's in the highest place in our nation's politics? Is it because we expect more from them? Why would we expect more from them when we've had no leadership on the issue for over a decade, with the exception, I really want to make that clear, with the exception of some standouts. But, I think the events were so shocking, the response was so lacking. But I don't think we should shy away from the reality that violence against women exists in every corner of the Australian community and in every workplace. And I know you'll jump in and ask some more questions, Emma, but before we go on, I think it's really important to acknowledge the really significant impact above and beyond that this violence has on First Nations communities. And we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experience all forms of family and domestic violence at significantly higher rates than non-Indigenous Australians. And Aboriginal women are twice as likely to be killed by an intimate partner, and they're up to 32 times more likely to be hospitalised as a result of family violence. And we know that's just, again, the iceberg, the tip of the statistics. So the everyday violent reality of Aboriginal women's lives is something that we haven't even begun to address. And we absolutely need to support community-led solutions in that space.
Thanks, Kate. It's such an important point. I think you very graciously in your essay say, you're not going to speak for people that when you don't have that experience or you haven't consulted with them. We found the same in the work we did in our report on gender equity last year, that we didn't want to speak on behalf of First Nations women, trans women, other women that we couldn't represent. But we don't pay enough attention to those intersectional issues, do we? We don't have the data. We don't have the research to show how much more prevalent it is in women that are marginalised by multiple intersectional forces, but also what the specific solutions to those issues might be. And it's because we don't talk to those communities.
Definitely. And then when we do, it's almost like we want to fit them into these really neat boxes. And, God forbid we come across a First Nations woman with a disability in a lesbian relationship with a non-Indigenous woman, God forbid, because, we have these really siloed solutions when we do look to diversity. We have to get better at that because it's absolutely failing. It's failing women and children, and it's also allowing us to not respond effectively to people who use violence. So we've got to, across the whole spectrum in terms of responses and prevention, we've got to do a better job there.
We do. Like you, I'm a nerd for the data and the access to the information. It's frustrating when it's not produced. I want to go back to something you said there about we expect more of our leaders, and we've been badly let down. And I was at the march. Coincidentally, I was due to be in Canberra on the Tuesday after the March for Justice for work. So I thought, I'm going up the day before and I'll march in Canberra. It was an incredible feeling that day, and my colleagues and friends that went in Melbourne said the same thing. And there was a feeling, I think, that surely they can't ignore this. And yet 6-8 months later, as the Prime Minister says, are we moving on? They just want to move on from that. Why shouldn't we really, more than expect, but demand better of our leaders? And how have, in a way, I think things have got worse amongst the leadership of our country in relation to gender politics?
Absolutely. I entirely agree, Emma. And I really thought it would be a turning point because the noise was so loud. And that's a credit to everyone that marched and every journalist that covered it and every person that spoke up. That I thought, you couldn't possibly not act on this. And that, there's been some movement, I'll say. I won't go as far as actions. I'll say there's been some movement. We've got the development of the next national plan. on violence against women. And so that's in the development phase at the moment. And there was a Women's Safety Summit. That's probably a whole nother conversation around that. It ended up being virtual, obviously because of COVID. And the Prime Minister delivered the opening keynote address at that. But when we look to actions, when we look to clear accountability of how violence against women is responded to when it occurs in the highest level of politics, you'd understand why so many women who are experiencing violence in their everyday lives do not report. And I think this is so important. And what I've been thinking a lot about over the last 6 months as I've kind of looked to what I think is an absolute leadership vacuum is that it's amazing to see how different people and different practitioners and advocates and leaders within the community have really stepped up to take on that challenge and to demand change. You know, March for Justice is one of the examples of that community-led and advocacy-spurned leadership. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that that is where our leadership is coming from at the moment, and that we do have people at that community and advocacy level that are stepping into the space that politicians are just leaving completely empty. I'm so fortunate in my role at Monash to work quite closely in my research with a lot of people in the specialist women's sector, and they're phenomenal. I think a lot about the way that they advocate for improved responses. You know, they're flying the plane while desperately rallying for improved parts and the need for petrol, but keeping it on course at the same time.
And refueling midair, right?
Absolutely. And at the same time, you know, they're losing air hosts left, right, and centre. So, you know, and then we've seen, you know, when we think about leadership, we can't go past what we've seen in terms of victim survivor leadership and advocacy, you know, incredible across Australia. And, you know, we've seen so many victim survivors step into the spotlight, and we know that that comes at a significant personal cost often, and they've done so quite often to demand change for systems that failed them. Because
you talk about that in the essay, particularly about Rosie Batty's experience. And you know, quite shocked to realise reading your essay that it's 7 years since Luke Batty was killed, and he would have been 18 by now. And that really, you note in your essay that what seemed to shift there was Rosie's courage and ability to speak through her pain that really galvanised a moment back 7 years ago, that we thought then, you know, she became Australian of the Year in 2015. As you say, she did 250 speaking engagements. She put everything into that, having been through every parent's worst nightmare. And we now this year have another incredibly outspoken and brave victim survivor in Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, of course, speaking up. These women, the courage of these women not only isn't being matched by our political and media class, but in many cases it's being undermined, isn't it?
Absolutely. And in some cases, you know, it's being quite overtly undermined. And, you know, we're seeing that most recent, some examples of that quite recently. But I think also the inaction over a decade, nearly a decade now since Rosie Batty stepped into her role in the days following Luke's killing, that inaction has undermined the leadership as well. And I think what's important to note here is that it's not entirely across the board. We look to Victoria, for example, and the leadership that the Victorian state government has shown. Of course, you know, we can look at individual parts of the system and criticise it and say, you know, could we be doing this, and this better? But here we have a state government that's committed more than 4.1 billion over 5 years. That's more than all other Australian states and territories and the Commonwealth government combined. Imagine if we had a Commonwealth government that took family violence seriously. We're not even asking about all forms of violence against women there. That's what the Victorian government's given to family violence. So we know that governments could take it seriously. And you know, I'm always loath to say that this is just about dollars, but I think it does come down somewhat to funding and the need for funding as we move forward, because even though we know funding isn't going to be enough to ultimately eliminate violence against women, there's a much bigger cultural piece. Funding is absolutely an essential piece of that puzzle. And what we've never seen at the Commonwealth level is funding commensurate with the gravity of the problem that we're trying to tackle.
I do. It's interesting that you raise the Victorian funding, and of course, it's the only state that's had a royal commission into this issue, and of course was driven largely by my late friend Fiona Richardson when she was the Minister for Women. It seems to take really. I'm one of those. I'm going to get to the point here. I'm one of those people that talks about, yes, leadership is seeing women in leadership is important, seeing women in positions of influence is important, but if we don't change the system itself, you can have as many women in power as possible. What I think Fiona did was she used her power to make real change. And one of the challenges I think we have is that our system of government, our systems of power are so patriarchal that often when women manage to succeed in them, in order to maintain their power, they're not able to threaten that internally, that patriarchal system.
Absolutely. I think it's incredibly important, and we can look to, I think, incredibly diverse examples of female politicians in recent years to see that play out. And, a lot of reflections, I think, over the media over the last year, in particular to the treatment of Julia Gillard when she was our first female Prime Minister. Women go boldly into those spaces, but it's very hard to remain bold, and particularly so if you want to take what is problematically often termed a women's issue and make it yours. So I think it's been fantastic to see that incredible leadership that Minister Richardson, really spurned has continued beyond Minister Richardson's term and her passing. But also that we've seen male leaders in Victoria step into the space. We need men to step into this space. So often, when I'm speaking, when we're at events, it is all women. This national crisis is not serving men well.
No.
It's not serving our young boys well that are growing up in homes where violence is every day, where they're learning to use violence from an early life, that they're going into relationships that are unhealthy, that they're, going into prison at high rates. Nobody's winning from this. So it's important that we tackle it as a whole of community and an everybody issue.
It's something you bring out really well in your essay, I think, is that it's not, family violence is called family violence for a reason, because, and I've had this similar conversation with Jess Hill, which is that it's often the children that are forgotten in this. You point out, shocking statistic in your book that one child a fortnight is killed by their parents in Australia. And I'd like you to sort of unpack that a little bit, but also what you just referred to, it's more than that. It's the role modelling, it's the environment and the norms that they're being raised to expect. If we can't get our leadership to take women's safety seriously, surely they can take the safety of their own children. As the Prime Minister said, you've got to think about it as if this girl was your daughter.
Absolutely. And the Victorian Royal Commission, I think, absolutely kind of nailed this when they describe children as the silent victims and the often forgotten victims of family violence. We have been so focused on thinking about this as a female victim, male perpetrator issue, we forget the incredible span of age in terms of victimisation, but also in terms of impact. In thinking about this as a problem that's going to take multiple generations to solve, we need to remember the amount of children right now that are growing up in households that are violent. Of course, they will not all, we know, go on to perpetrate, some will. But the impact of that over time, and then also those children that are victims, as you said, the statistic that we know and that has remained stubbornly persistent, that once a fortnight a child in Australia is killed by their parent. We need to understand that. We need to understand where were the points of intervention. So often, and we know from coronial inquiries, we saw it in the case of the killing of Luke Batty. So often these are children that are known to systems, that are known to multiple systems, but we're not piecing those puzzles together. We don't have our basics around risk identification, assessment, management, information sharing properly in order. And there's some of the big challenges that the Victorian Royal Commission has sought to really improve, but we need to do that at a national level.
Yeah,
we need to ensure that we have whole of system safety responses to women and children. And it's been really interesting over the last 6 months, really listening to a lot of the advocacy around this in terms of the development of the next national plan, because the former plan was called the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Their Children. And there's been a lot of advocacy to say, no, we need a plan that understands children in their own right. It can't just be their children. So women are children are the extension of their mothers. We have to look at children in their own right and what their support and safety needs are. And I think that's absolutely critical.
And it's part of that same mentality, isn't it? Children extension of their mothers, mothers are extension of their partners or their parents. It's all about control. And I want to talk to you about coercive control, which is something you bring up. But before I do that, I think reflecting on this issue about children and how they are often the forgotten victims of this. Obviously, there's been this massive outpouring of relief and happiness over the last 2 days that Cleo Smith's been found alive and well. And how unusual that is in a case of abduction, particularly stranger abduction. You also point out in your book that what fills the public imagination about violence against women is those very rare incidences where it is a stranger, just as it has been in Cleo's case with the abduction. But, you know, I'm talking about women like Jill Maher and Eurydice Dixon and Marta Vukotic, sorry. And I think the other one you included was Ayam Masawe in your essay. We all remember these cases because they were so shocking. And yet, as you've just pointed out, the children that are known to the system, the women that are known to the system, the women that are killed by intimate partners, it's almost as though we're still blaming them. And you say this in your essay, when it's a stranger attack, oh, they're blameless. But when it's someone they know or that's known to them, we hold women and children somehow responsible for being in this situation. This is the really wicked challenge to me. How do we change that?
100%. It is the challenge, and you know, we see it so often, and every time we see it, and we see it so overtly, you know, media calls it out and we promise it's not going to happen again, and it does. And it's happening at the highest levels. It's happening across a range of different settings. And I think, you know, it's interesting thinking about our different reactions to stranger danger versus the everyday reality of intimate partner violence. And, you know, I know after some of those cases, the killing of Eurydice Dixon, Jill Maher, I'll hear friends check in with each other. Oh, you know, buzz me on your phone if you're walking home on your own. You know, don't do that. You know, can someone come and get you? How many of us feel comfortable to pick up our phone and call our friend to say, you know, how are you doing? Is everything all right? How's things going in your relationship?
Yeah.
You know, heard that your partner lost his job. How's he coping with that? Are you guys going okay? Do you feel safe? Do you need support? We don't have those conversations. Despite
it's intrusive, right?
And exactly. And it's invasive, and it feels, you know, all a bit private. And, you know, I think that's something I feel like I've been saying for over 15 years now, since doing research around the provocation defense and the courts. And, you know, those classic narratives of she asked for it. You know, adultery is not punishable by death. So even in cases where we can see, you know, that a partner's left someone, you're allowed to do that. Or where, you know, God forbid someone's cheated on someone. It's not punishable by death in this country.
No.
But we really make excuses for it, and we really, you know, hold men to account less when we can explain away their actions. We can say, oh, it wouldn't happen to me because I wouldn't have done that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's like you say, it's partly, I think that I think you've hit the nail. I wouldn't have done that. And I think a lot of women feel like that too, that, you know, am I to blame for staying in this relationship? Will people feel some sympathy for me? Am I responsible for his emotions and his reactions? And it's such a common pattern, isn't it, in violence against women, that for a long time women will think, well, I can fix this, or yes, I do have some blame here. But as you've just said, we're allowed to leave our partners.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we need to get better at increasing the awareness and the understanding of that. We need to get better at everyone across the community being able to have these conversations and being able to empower women, children, men, everyone in the community to live safely. And I think everyone has a role that they can play in that, whether it's a co-worker that mentions an argument they've had with their partner, whether it's, you know, chatting with another family member or a friend. We need to be able to have those conversations. We need to be able to empower people to make good choices and safe choices.
And you raised the issue. I think that the case that reminded me, I remember this one very well, was the murder of Julie Ramage by her husband, of manslaughter as it was in the end.
Yes.
which I think goes to exactly what you're saying. They'd separated. He felt that she was his property, and that was a case, really, wasn't it, that ended, led to the end of the defence of provocation, which is only, it can't be more than 15 years ago.
It's not. I mean, James Ramage was sentenced for manslaughter in the Victorian Supreme Court in 2004.
Right.
Interestingly, last week we saw a provocation defence case in Queensland, in a case where a man had killed his partner who he believed was cheating on him. The exact same thing, the exact same narratives.
And that really goes to such an ancient and antiquated idea, provocation, that I've provoked you by having sex with someone else, effectively means I'm your property.
Absolutely, it is. It is, 16th century English law. And we still see, it's rare these days, thank gosh, but it's still happening, that we're seeing provocation defences, despite 2 to 3 decades of advocacy and reform efforts, still slipping through. And if that's happening so brazenly in those cases, then we wonder why people are hesitant to call the police, to report. We wonder why sexual assault reporting rates are so low, why then once it gets to prosecution and court, we see it drop even more.
And yet, even when women do reach out for help, as you show in your essay, they can reach out repeatedly, daily, for help. The case of Hannah Clark and her children, she'd done everything to kind of try and protect her children, move them out of a dangerous situation. We don't have the systems in place, and the systems don't respond. And you tell a shocking tale in your essay of a woman reaching out repeatedly for help against a violent former partner. She had an order against him, and when the police were called, they did nothing, and she was killed.
Yeah, and I think they're referring to the killing of Kelly Thompson, and this was in 2014, and it really has stuck with me. I don't think it's necessarily exceptional. This happens. It absolutely does, but it's one that I've really remembered. And Kelly had called the police at least 35 times, and that's the times that she connected through. I'm sure there were other times that she tried to reach them. She disclosed the violence to family, to neighbours, to work colleagues, to friends. 3 hours before Kelly was killed, the neighbour called the police to report that they could see that her estranged partner, had arrived at the house, which they knew was against an intervention order, and that he was acting strangely. And the neighbour told the police that he believed that there was a problem, and could they come and do something. And I'm checking the wording here because it's just, it always surprises me every time I come back to it. But the police officer said to the neighbour, can you do me a massive favour, pal, and keep an eye on the address? If you hear any yelling or screaming from the address, I'll send a van to have a look. 3 hours later, she was killed. This is a woman that had reached out repetitively, that there was a long file and known risk on. But this is how flippant we are.
Can you do me a favour, pal? It's a shocking
phrase. It is, and it's almost, it's no kind of slight on that individual officer, because this is the culture.
That's right.
That we're up against here. And this is why we have to tackle this on every single front if we are going to make any difference. We have to ensure that every point at which women try and reach out for help, that it is a response that they get, that it's confirming to them that they're not, out on a ledge. They're not demanding something above and beyond what they should. We need to ensure there's safe housing.
Yes.
Just astounding to me that in Australia, family violence is the leading cause of women's homelessness, and women over 55 years old are the fastest growing population of homeless people. Surely we can do better than that.
We have to do better. I think that's a statistic I came across in my first day on the job at Per Capita over 5 years ago, and it's getting worse. And the growing rates of, and women's homelessness is hidden, right? They don't tend to sleep in the streets for obvious reasons, as men do. But they're couch surfing, and they're sleeping on people's couches, and they're sleeping in their cars, and we're simply not providing the basic shelter to enable those women and their children to make a safe escape. It's something we've been, again, the Victorian state government has listened on this, and they're building more public housing, and they've dedicated a portion of it for women fleeing family violence. but we don't see those same moves at a national level.
No, we don't. And safe housing is just something we hear over and over again. And we need that at all different levels. We need the crisis housing, we need short-term housing, and we need long-term housing. And we need it to look a range of different ways. We need it to allow pets.
That's right.
You know, we hear stories from victim survivors who, of course, don't want to leave their pet with their abusive partner, never knowing if they'll see them again, or with an abusive partner who's threatened that pet, but they can't get into a refuge otherwise. Like, we need to understand the way people live and who they live with, and that makes
emotional support they need.
Absolutely. And we know that for so many women experiencing family violence, that they juggle this and kind of they make a decision between being homeless or remaining with an abusive partner. That's not a choice we should be asking any women to make.
And certainly not in a country as wealthy as this, Kate. You know, we are the second wealthiest country per capita on earth, and yet we cannot provide secure shelter to women and children fleeing family violence. It's a sad indictment. I want to remind everyone that if you have a question for Kate, please just do put it into the Q&A box and I will read it out on your behalf. There is a very interesting one here already that goes to what I was going to bring up with you next, because you talk about this in your essay. It's from an anonymous attendee, so I can't give you the name. Do you have any confidence in the new national plan delivering outcomes, especially given the level of stakeholder engagement and its long-term targets on reduction rather than prevention?
It's a really good question. It's such a current one. I've got to put a big caveat around this, because I'm leading the team at Monash who, for the Department of Social Services, has been undertaking the stakeholder consultation.
And that's very good news, Kate. We're happy to
Thank you, Emma. It's been an incredible privilege. We're just finishing up the report now, and we'll literally be pressing send in the next 24 hours. And we've heard from just over 480 stakeholders across Australia around what needs to be in this next national plan. So that's kind of the caveat of how I come to with this. But, if you're asking Kate, not consultation lead Kate,
yes.
I want to be hopeful, because if the national plan doesn't help us, like, what have we got? It has to be ambitious. It has to be ambitious. It has to have dollars attached to it. And it has to have really clear measures and monitoring mechanisms. Without those things, 5, 10, 12 years down the track, how will we know if we're doing any better? So that's really clear to me. It needs independence. I've been really taken and kind of watching how it's evolved over the last 5 years of the Family Violence Implementation Monitor, in Victoria, that was set up after the Victorian Royal Commission. So here we had a recommendation that you should have an independent, whether it be a commissioner, an implementation monitor, who oversees the implementation and holds government to account. It's a bold government that's happy to have that. And there's been some fantastic monitors in that role. I'd love to see that at the national level.
I think we all would. And as I said, it's terrific news for all of us that you're leading that stakeholder work and that they're actually listening to some experts. I think that one of the interesting things that was raised in that question that's in your essay as well is that we're not doing enough about prevention. When there's a shocking event like the murder of Hannah Clark and her children, there seems to be a kind of flurry of interest, and we talk about how we can prevent these things, but we're not putting in place the measures that might prevent things happening in the first place. We seem to be reacting. I think the questioner was interested in that too.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to, unfortunately, because we have such a crisis in our country, we have to do both. And it's because of the level that we've got to in terms of prevalence. We have so many people living with violence and experiencing violence. We have to ensure that there is an effective and evidence-informed and a well-funded whole of system response. Absolutely. But if we don't commit to focusing on prevention, we're going to be here again in 10 years' time. We can have that lunch. No, we're going to be having this same conversation, and we're just going to be watching people cycle through the system. Perhaps we get better, perhaps we catch them earlier, but we're not going to stop it. And I think, this is really important. And I think a lot of people, when we talk about some of the underlying causes of violence against women, globally, and certainly in Australia, the most important thing to say up front, violence against women and the responsibility for violence against women firmly lies with the person who uses violence, which is most commonly men. So that's absolutely a point of accountability that we have to have. But when we start to dig deeper about why we have the problem, we come across the absolute need to address gender inequality across our country. And Emma, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here and, preaching to an expert on the issue. But I think often people think that gender inequality is a really vague concept. And it's a bit abstract, we're never going to quite know if we're making progress there. So let's do some of these, let's introduce a new piece of legislation, because that's going to be a lot quicker and it's going to really show we're doing something. But gender inequality is absolutely the everyday experiences of insecurity that women and girls across Australia face. It's the gender pay gap. It currently stands at 13.9. And actually, since looking at that, I know that's what I said in my book, it's most likely worse now. We know that has gotten worse during COVID. It's extra hours, days, weeks that women and girls have to work to make the same salary as their male counterpart. It's the fact that Australian women retire with significantly less superannuation than men. And they're consequently at risk of living in poverty or facing homelessness. All these issues intersect. Unless we start to tackle some of these underlying issues, and I absolutely agree with the anonymous person, that has to be the aim of this next national plan. It's got to be to eliminate violence against women, because we've got to be ambitious here.
Yeah. And you raise in your book the same statistics that we've talked about a lot at Per Capita, the World Economic Forum's global gender gap, and picked up on something that I find as outrageous as you do, I think. Somehow my video's gone off. I don't know how that happened. Sorry. Which is that we're equal first in the world on educational attainment, right? So Australian women, we're doing everything we can. We're smart, we're educated, we're doing our best. And yet on economic inclusion, on safety, on health, we're way behind where we should be compared to other comparable countries.
This really shocked me, when I was kind of trawling through all these numbers in putting together this essay. It was really something that I don't have an answer for, but we absolutely have to be asking the question, because, how can it possibly be that we have some of the most educated women in the world, yet those same highly educated, experienced women experience inequality in so many other facets of their lives? So what is happening across a range of different settings that permeates that? And, I also think, when we just look across the field, we're 50th in the world on the gender gap. Even after, we can all, I hope, agree around, the legacy and the aftermath of Trump's presidency. Even after that, after a 4-year term where concerns surrounding, the erosion of women's rights were absolutely front and center, the US is still ahead of us. We really need to hold our leaders to account that this is a shame. We're not happy with this, and nor will we continue to settle. Yeah, it's such a high level of inequality.
It really is. And I think when we were doing the research for our gender equality report last year, a couple of years ago now, equally shocked at how a country that thinks of itself as incredibly egalitarian can be so behind the 8 ball. I want to read some other questions that have come from our audience, because as always, when it's a topic that we feel passionate about, the time is flying really quickly. David Simpkins put this question into the chat, but I found it, and it's an excellent one, and I think really pertinent to the time we live in. With such a devastating history of violence to women, nearly 1 woman murdered each week, is there some way of highlighting these murders on a regular basis publicly? And he makes the comparison, I think this is great, like our COVID reports, right? We've had constant updates on how many people have COVID, how many people are hospitalised, how many people have died. Is there some way of using that same communication to remind communities of exactly what's going on, obviously, as David says, while respecting the privacy of the people?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this. I've spent quite a lot of time along with colleagues at Monash over the last 5 years looking at Australia's femicide rates and looking at the killing of women and thinking about, what do we do to shift this dial? Because the prevalence has remained so stubborn over the last decade. And, we have, at a global level, we have things like the Global Terrorism Index, where we count deaths. Other jurisdictions, other global jurisdictions around the world have femicide indexes that remain regularly updated. And we have some fantastic work here, you know, particularly the work of the Destroy the Joint volunteers, where they do count women's deaths. That's a group of volunteers that are doing that. We're so fortunate that they are. But that is something that we should absolutely be resourcing and providing a national platform to, because I think, you know, exactly what David says, when we bring it into the spotlight as something that occurs every week, people start talking about it. People start noticing that these aren't one-off instances. These aren't high-profile cases. This is something that's constantly occurring, and they start demanding change, or they start thinking about how they can be part of that change or how it might impact them. And so it's really important that we do bring, you know, violence against women is every day in Australia. So we need to bring it into our everyday consciousness almost. And I think a toll is a really important part of that. We did see earlier this year, the House of Representatives inquiry into family, domestic and sexual violence recommended the establishment of a national femicide index or toll, you know, almost in the same way as drunk driving deaths and deaths on the road. You know, we certainly can't prevent, we can't eliminate what we don't count. So it's a good place to start.
And I think that's, you're singing my tune there. You know, we've often said we can't fix what we can't measure, and we don't produce enough statistics across the board on women's equality, but particularly on violence against women. There's an interesting question in the talk that goes to something I was wanting to raise with you, actually. We've just completed the 4th year of Per Capita's evidence-based policy project, where we look at different pieces of legislation and whether they've been done properly. And this year, one of the cases that we looked at was the, well, they call it the merger, but effectively the abolition of the family court. I'm really interested in your thoughts on that. Our research found there was very, very little, if any, evidence to warrant the merger of the family court with the Federal Circuit Court, and that there'd be a loss of specialist knowledge for people. You know, we know that most of the cases that came before the family court experienced family violence. So I'd like your thoughts on that, but also the question that relates to this from the Q&A. Can you talk to, and very clever here, the national shame of the family court dismissing victims and silencing them on domestic violence, as well as ensuring abusers have unsupervised contact with their children, causing more harm? And I think this, what this goes back to, is the change in the law under the Howard government that assumed the right of the father to see their child rather than put the right of the child first. What are your thoughts about all that?
And there we are. We're returning again to kind of bringing children into focus, which is so important. The family law system, you know, where do you get started? I think what is most shocking for the family law system, you know, it's the perfect example of inaction, is that for over 2 decades, we've now had reviews and research. We talk about the evidence. The evidence on the family law system is absolutely in. We know that women experiencing all forms of domestic and family violence, and children who go through the family law courts, do not feel supported, do not feel safe, do not remain safe, and that is not an effective response to their support and security needs. We've known that for over 2 decades. So where is the action on that? You know, we've had, you know, inquiries into family law systems that have taken submissions, held public inquiries, made recommendations, and then the silence is deafening. And there is no follow-up and no action. And whether it's 5, 6, 7, 10 years later, we run the process again. And the same thing's happening. We absolutely need change, need reform in the family courts. And the answer is definitely not, in my view, removing specialisation. We need those judges, all people who are engaged, all professionals who are engaged in the family law court, the legal practitioners, the registrars, the judges, they need to have specialist family violence training, because we know that so many people who come before that court have experiences of family violence. They need to understand what a child-centric decision-making model would look like that truly keeps children safe. And safety, absolutely. You know, we talk about the right, you know, thinking of women as property. Let's look at this as an example of children as property. You know, children have a right to safety. Women have a right to recovery, and that has to trump someone's perceived need or right to see their child if they're violent.
agree. And I think
We need a revolution on the family law court.
We do, and not the revolution of that we've seen recently in federal cabinet.
No.
My friend and co-editor of our book last year, Janet McColman's got, I think, a really interesting question. Janet's, of course, an historian and with a particular expertise in public health. And she asked, the great challenge is the intergenerational transfer of violence. You can build family trees back into the 19th century of violence from generation to generation. So how do we maintain a focus on the immediate crisis while addressing the learnt behaviours deep in our society, mostly among men, but also among women?
Yeah, I think this is so important, and this is, one of those issues that we absolutely have to really dig into. And I think the challenge here is that it's going to be hard to evidence the progress that's made, but we will see it over time because the rates of violence against women will go down. I completed some work looking at adolescents who use violence in the home, and we were really fortunate to speak with mothers who had experienced adolescent family violence from their children, and both young males and young girls. And in those cases, we had a number of women who reflected on the intergenerational transfer and that learned behaviour that Janet mentioned that they saw in their own house, where once an abusive partner, perhaps the children's father, but maybe not, left the house or, was left the family, left the relationship, the eldest male stepped into the role. And that was a young male who had never been violent in the house before, but that was all they knew about how you exercise your power and your control and your male leadership within the home. That's how you do it. That's what they've learnt. So you can't imagine for 1 minute that once that young male then goes into dating relationships, that's not transferring across. That the kind of the sexual violence and the coercive control, the property damage, the psychological abuse that we were hearing towards mothers and siblings within the household doesn't carry through with them. So we absolutely have to start earlier. That's about education. And there's been so much debate and discussion around respectful relationships, respectful and healthy relationships. It's about sexual consent education. So the incredible campaign last year from Chanel Contos in this space, and talking about, let's expand knowledge amongst young people of how to make informed, good, safe choices in their sexual relationships. So we need age-appropriate, culturally safe and accessible education across the whole system, because, in all of us, in all of our lives, and it comes down to COVID and what we're seeing with information there, knowledge is power. So we need to equip our young people to know what safe and healthy relationships look like, and to challenge or to seek safety when they're not in them.
Absolutely. It is, as Janet said, though, it's an intergenerational traumas that take generations.
They do. Absolutely. And where we began with the history of colonialism and the impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
We're a country founded on violence, right? Yeah. I think you mentioned there, and this is something we're rapidly running out of time, but I did really want to get you to talk about this issue, because we're a little behind the 8 ball here in Australia. I'm originally from the UK. There's been a lot of movement there on coercive control and recognising coercive control as a form of violence. We're not quite there yet here in this country. Where do you think we need to go to understand that more? Well, there's a lot of popular use of the word gaslighting now around our Prime Minister, right? So people seem to be getting their heads around it, but we haven't really grappled with it as well.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of debate around coercive control, and I think there's a couple of different layers to what's needed here. I'd say, at the outset, what we absolutely need to take from understanding all forms of family violence as coercive control is that it takes us away from looking at and judging those individual incidents of violence, and it encourages us to look at a pattern of violence, which is so critical to understanding the impact and also understanding the recovery needs of the person that's experiencing that abuse. So that switch has to occur. And, that needs to occur across the whole system, across our community awareness and our understanding of what family violence looks like. There's then this kind of very hotly debated question around criminalisation of coercive control. And, as you mentioned, the UK, in England and Wales, in Scotland, they have criminalised coercive and controlling behaviours in 2015. And I was really fortunate to spend a bit of time in England and Wales and in Edinburgh in 2016 speaking as part of a Churchill Fellowship with a lot of the people who had really advocated for those laws and some of the people that were kind of seeing it initially through. I'm not sure we're quite there yet, which is not always a popular opinion, but we look at a lot of what we've discussed today. We look at the way in which our system fails women, the way in which our police response is failing women who call and are black and blue and bleeding. And we're expecting those same officers to turn up to an incident to understand patterns of behaviour that can sometimes be such small incidents, but because of the cumulative effect, they instill fear in the everyday lives of a person, that person's walking on eggshells. They feel like they're in a war zone. They genuinely believe the smallest behaviour they know from that perpetrator may mean their life's at risk. But I'm not sure our system's ready to respond to that yet. I hate that it's not, but I'm just not sure it is. And I feel very nervous about us sending out a message to Australian women that if you experience coercive control, there's a criminal justice system response ready for that, because I think we'll fail women. I think we'll misidentify them. I think women will end up being identified as the perpetrators of family violence, and that has significant impacts. I think we'll over-criminalise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in a way that we have for generations. So maybe we get there, but there's some really important foundational work that we have to do first around that education piece, around community awareness of understanding coercive control. Absolutely. Family violence occurs as a pattern of abuse. We need to build it into risk assessment. We see that. We've learned, the incredibly hard lesson from the killing of Hannah Clark. Coercive control is one of the leading behaviours that's seen when we look back on the deaths of women. So we need to build it into risk assessment.
And it busts that myth too, doesn't it, that I remember Mark Latham saying this, and I'm sorry to bring up Mark Latham. I'm always sorry to bring up Mark Latham, but saying years ago that, family violence happens in working class homes where men feel marginalised, and it's nonsense. We know that it has no respect for class boundaries, but it may manifest differently. And so a lot of the time, I had this conversation with someone the other day who said a young student whose research is in violence and drug abuse in high wealth households, and that she finds it very difficult. People say, well, I don't have much sympathy for them. But often women in that situation will experience violence first as the control or the cutting off of money or coercive control.
Yeah, absolutely. And, people assume that women in those situations, because they might, within the context of their relationship, have access to resources or be financially well off, they assume that they also have the mechanisms to leave. They don't. And they also perhaps have even, additional barriers or unique barriers to seeking help because of that. We absolutely have to accept, I know I'm saying this numerous times, we absolutely have to accept that violence against women is occurring in every single corner of our community. It's not a problem of one culture, one age group, one socioeconomic status group. It is everywhere. But we need our responses to be to cater to all the different diversity of experiences.
Very challenging. I'm going to finish with a question from Ben, which I've been holding on to for the end. But this is an interesting point. Is there a danger or an unintended consequence in talking only of the horrific and tragic failures across the family violence system, that women will feel a sense of hopelessness and not seek help? Everyday family violence support workers, police, health workers and justice staff implement interventions which do change the lives of victims, survivors for the better. Should we not also be highlighting those positive interventions in order to give people some faith?
Yeah, Ben, thank you. And Emma, thank you for kind of holding this to the end, because it is so important. The people working in our family violence system across the country are incredible. They're facing a tsunami, but they're doing a fantastic job of pulling people out of the water wherever they can. For women, children, men, for anyone who's experiencing family violence, there are options, there are supports, and keep trying and keep knocking on different doors to find the right door for you, because absolutely it should be there. And I think it is a really important message to send out. There's significant problems with the system, but we absolutely have to keep empowering, demanding, supporting people to be safe. So that's really important. And, you know, there is a fantastic system out there in terms of the individuals in it. And there's some great examples of pockets of best practice. And I think what would be really good to see is more celebration of those pockets. And something we've been thinking about a lot in what we've heard across the National Plan consultation is how do we do better at sharing the learnings across the Australian state and territories? Because, you know, we've heard some great things about what's happening in that regional town there, or this metropolitan city there, but then over here doesn't know about it and they're facing a really similar problem. So we need to share the learnings. We need to build in evaluations. Of course, the academic's going to say that, but let's understand what's working, what's cost effective, what improves safety outcomes, and let's throw our resources at it. Absolutely.
I think like anything, like we've seen with COVID, like we see with climate change, the frontline workers are incredible and they do an amazing job, but they're being let down all the time by a lack of leadership, a lack of funding, a lack of systems investment. And we're also incredibly lucky to have people like you and your colleagues at Monash working in the evidence space for this and leading. You know, it's again just really encouraging to hear that you're working on that stakeholder engagement piece for the national plan. So thank you for your work, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. We're almost out of time. It's gone so quickly, and I'm sorry to anyone whose questions I didn't get to. I did my best to cover them all and combined a couple into one where I had to. But thank you again, Kate. It's a really, I would show you the essay, but I've lent it to a friend.
You know what? I actually had it nearby.
There you go.
How funny! So
I went to reread it this week. And got it, so
enjoying being at home, you can easily grab things.
Yeah, it's an excellent read, as are all the essays in the National Interest series. And our next conversation with the National Interest series author will be with Fiona McLeod, and I think that one's on the 28th of November on her essay on easy lies and influence. So do join us then if you'd like to. But our next event in our webinar series is a conversation with Lek Blaine, who's the author of the current quarterly essay, which is called The Larrikin Myth, Class and Power in Australia. Good top blokes, The Larrikin Myth, Class and Power. It's an excellent read. And that's at 1 p.m. on Wednesday, the 17th of November. So all of you, I hope you can join us then. But again, Kate, thank you for the work you do. As much as we, I think, feel despair sometimes at the state of leadership across these issues in the country, we know that we've got some of the very best minds working on this, and you're certainly one of those leading practitioners. So thank you for your time and for your work. Thank you, Emma. That's so kind. It's just been an absolute delight to have this chat with you. So thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. It's now 8:29. So I will, I don't know about you, but I'm not far away from bed on a Thursday night. It's been a lovely way to spend the evening. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you at our very next Per Capita event.